Albert Wenger. With Albert Wenger, he is managing partner at Union Square Ventures, and he's the author of a book called World After Capital, which I highly recommend for everyone here. And he's going to be sharing some of the ideas in his book with us, and hopefully we can discuss them afterwards. Some of them are really unconventional, so I'm excited to see the discussion after that. And then we're going to have Divya and Matt. Divya is a co-author of the Who Watches the Watchmen paper with me and others who are not in this room, but who are a part of this group as well. And she is an APAST and associate political economist and social technologist at Microsoft, and a researcher in digital democracy and data governance. And Matt Prewitt, who will also be presenting today, he is the president of Radical Exchange Foundation, which is an organization researching and implementing next generation political economies. So I'm super excited to have this group today. Albert, I'm going to turn it over to you and we can get started.
Well, thank you, Paula, for that kind introduction, and also thank you for organizing these workshops. So as Paula mentioned, the book is called The World After Capital. I've been writing it for, I think, going on 7 years, although I am finishing it this year, and I am publishing an actual paper copy for those who still want that. You can find it online at worldaftercapital.org. And at the large scale, the book really is about the sort of urgent need to transcend the industrial age and create a new age, which in the book I call the knowledge age. One of the key ideas in the book is that that humanity has gone through 3 big ages today: the forge age, the agrarian age, and the industrial age, and that these ages were marked by different scarcities. So food in the agrarian age, food in the forger age, land in the agrarian age, capital in the industrial age, which is why the book is called World After Capital. And I make the argument that capital actually is no longer scarce, in the sense that we have enough physical capital in the world to meet everybody's needs, but that what's really scarce now is attention, and that we're not paying attention to some of the most important problems, both at the individual and at the collective level. I then go on and talk about how we might have a less painful transition. So the past transitions between these ages were extremely painful. Getting from the agrarian age to the industrial age basically had many revolutions and then culminated in 2 world wars. And we are again on the path to a very bad transition because we're very far behind on dealing with the climate crisis. And I talk specifically about 3 types of changes that I think could help, and I call them economic freedom, informational freedom, and psychological freedom. Economic freedom is more or less some form of UBI. And so one of the things I'm very excited about is the potential of creating UBI without governments, but creating it instead a UBI by the people, for the people, through the people, if you so want. Informational freedom has a lot to do with the question as to who controls computation on these devices, which are supercomputers that we all carry around and that can talk to any other supercomputer in the world via the internet. And then psychological freedom is about our ability or inability to self-regulate in a way that lets us live freely in a world. So even if you had economic freedom and you had informational freedom, but you weren't sort of psychologically free, that is, you were constantly checking your Twitter feed, or you were constantly getting upset by something somebody else said on the internet, or that sort of constantly wanting a bigger house, a bigger boat, a bigger whatever, there'd be many ways not to be free. So Paula has asked me specifically to talk about some of the ideas around privacy because they are, let's just say, unconventional. And 12 minutes, which is what Paula gave me, and I've already taken a couple up by giving the overview idea, is very short, but I will try my best. So I think the starting point is that there can be no doubt that there are situations in which if something is revealed about you, it's very bad, right? So Afghanistan just got taken over by the Taliban again. The Taliban is very much anti-homosexuality. If your sexual preference was revealed, that'd be very bad for you, right? that same example, though, shows that privacy clearly isn't a panacea, because if you're a woman in Afghanistan, things have just gotten much worse for you as well, and there's no hiding that you're a woman. So I think one of the arguments I make is that privacy isn't actually a value in and of itself, and it shouldn't even be considered a right in and of itself, but rather it is a kind of a tool. It's a tool that we have used in some instances to try and carve out some freedom for people. And as this example from Afghanistan shows, it's very limited in its capability. So if you live in a very bad place, privacy is not going to get you very far. And I am very much supportive of encryption. I'm very much supportive of anonymous expression, pseudonymous expression. I'm not trying to argue against any of these. I'm just trying to argue that I think a unthinking, wholehearted embrace of privacy as a be-all, end-all human right or value in and of itself is actually very problematic. And so let me try and make that case a little bit. So the first part is that, like any other tool, tools can be used for good or bad things, right? So one of the earliest things that humans invented, were, like, let's say, arrows and axes, and you could use those to go hunt and feed your tribe, or you could use those to make war against another tribe. And privacy, you could use it to hide your sexual preference, but you might also use it to bribe a politician privately by making a private money transfer to that politician that is not traceable, not discoverable, it's hidden. And so it shows that, just the fact that you can do something privately or keep something private isn't in and of itself a good thing. It depends on what the circumstances are to a large degree. The next problem with the sort of extreme pursuit of privacy is that there is a conflict with the freedom of computation. And so, I don't have an iPhone, I have an Android phone, and I'm even thinking of going away from an Android phone, but why do I not have an iPhone? Because Apple sort of uses privacy to say, well, we got to control the endpoint, because that's the only way we can really assure privacy. And the way we control the endpoint is because we have the App Store monopoly. So thou shalt not sideload applications, it's a bad thing. And I think that that's one of the ways, the many ways in which computation is being restricted. So you can think about a doctor's computer, for example. If you send a medical X-ray to the doctor will have to decrypt that image in order to be able to look at it. And at that point, the only way to provide a strong privacy assurance would be to really have a lockdown computing endpoint. And I think that's very problematic. By the way, that still leaves out the analog hole, meaning the doctor could snap a picture of their own screen using a phone. So I think there's a conflict between my freedom to compute any which way I want and providing extremely strong privacy guarantees. This also extends to other notions of extremely strong privacy guarantees. So this phone has a camera on it. I was in Siena earlier, walking around the streets, I was taking pictures. In those pictures, there are many humans. Now the question is, should or should I not have the right to run facial recognition software on this phone to examine who those people are? And some people say, yeah, no, you shouldn't have that right. That's very bad. But then, not that long ago in the US, we had uniformed officers on the streets of cities that had removed or taped over the identifying marks. And it was private citizens who used facial recognition of their phones to identify who those people are. So we often tend to think about the surveillance use case, but not often about the surveillance use case of facial recognition. And I think it's very problematic to try and construct a world where all these technologies like facial recognition, DNA sequencing, and so forth are highly, highly controlled. I think that's a very, very dangerous world to be living in. And then the final argument that I want to make, and then I'll stop, is that I think in the long run, and by this I don't mean tomorrow, but in the long run, I think there's a more fundamental incompatibility between privacy and technological progress. And that has to do with the fact that entropy is sort of a foundational aspect of the universe. There are very few arrangements of molecules that make a human body. Most immediately adjacent arrangements don't actually make a human body. And it takes, call it 20 years to have an adult, and it takes a split second to kill an adult, right? And so as we make technological progress, unfortunately, because of entropy, our ability to create always lags significantly behind our ability to destroy. And so technology has this unfortunate side effect of amplifying our ability to destroy much, much faster than our ability to create. And I think this puts a pretty severe constraint on privacy over time. So I think that societies have a fairly legitimate right to know what people are doing when people have vast capabilities of destruction at their hand, right? So if I'm trying to make a more lethal version of the coronavirus in my basement, I think society has a legitimate right to know that. So all of this is a way of saying that I think that I understand the desire for privacy. I understand why it's needed in many parts of the world. But my view of privacy is one of a tool with potentially dangerous applications, and a tool that if it's pursued without being really careful and thoughtful about it, could also bring up with it many negative things. And I'll leave it at that.
All right. Thank you so much, Albert. This was a really interesting provocation, and it will be fascinating to discuss that afterwards. I'll change things up just a little bit in our schedule for today. And before we hear from Matt and Divya, we'll just do a quick pause to reflect on this and get back to our police exercise from last week, which just fits in really well with this introduction by Albert. I'm pasting the police exercise here. And I want to ask you to take some minutes to add a few more statements there. This is a super useful tool. We got incredible insights on our first use of that, and I want to see what comes up as we continue to use it today. So, just any response that you might have to it, you can add to the police exercise, and we're going to take 7 minutes for that. So feel free to add statements, and if you don't have any more, you can start liking, disliking, or passing them.
Just one thing to add, we'll do this as a breakout room for 7 minutes, so you'll also have a chance to talk to one another as you contribute these ideas.
Did anybody else get kicked out of the whole Zoom when they left the breakout room?
Nope.
Just me. I'm gonna chalk that one up to user error then.
Just you.
There were a couple of people, we just had to readmit them.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for this, continue to engage with our police exercise. Hopefully this already had some interesting discussions. Now we're going to move for Divya and Matt's presentation, and then have a wider discussion after that. So Divya and Matt, hand it over to you.
Amazing. I am going to share my screen. You can tell me if this is working. Okay. So the earlier presentation by Albert was super helpful in setting up our presentation and will likely save us some time actually in terms of setting up some of the questions, which is great, and thank you. I think we have sort of been approaching identity through a bunch of different lenses in this group. And I think some of those lenses have really come from this perspective of, well, what does it look like to build an identity layer for the internet or for some other function? And today, Matt and I will be talking about kind of taking a slightly different tactic and saying, well, we have a specific problem we want to solve. And, identity is something that is going to play into that problem, and we need a way to think about it and to architect it into our solution if we're going to solve this problem. And so, can we build an identity solution that is quite targeted towards this problem that we want to solve? And what is that question? Well, we are going to talk about data coalitions. And I think so many of the kind of freedoms that Albert talked about in the previous session, economic, informational, psychological freedom, are underpinned in a lot of ways by having autonomy and agency over our data. And sometimes this focus on data sort of obscures what is really at stake here, which is a focus on people, right? And the many kind of outgrowths and different attributes of people that are kind of shifted around, and we want to have autonomy and agency over, including the agency to sort of build collectives of people to steward this data rather than thinking about it as a fully individual concept. And so the specific piece that we're looking at today will be what we call disclosure externalities. This is one of those lovely internet illustrations that may be incredibly outdated, I don't know. But basically what we're trying to say here is, our decisions about our data have huge effects on other people, right? If you kind of share one piece of data that is, say, an email, then it also implicates and shares the data, who you sent that to and maybe what time and potentially their response and their email address. I mean, in this very networked way, it's quite impossible to reasonably think about data as a very individual phenomenon. And yet many of the ways that we kind of, talk about privacy as to the points made earlier, as well as, regulation and all of those things, still really have a very narrow view of data as, individual private property or something that, one person can keep very private, when that's just really not possible. And so these disclosure externalities, where our decisions have these big effects on other people, result basically from failures to bring this into the models that we use to think about data. And they're one of the biggest problems underlying a lot of issues in our digital ecosystem. And so, we can think about even very small specific things that we might want to do, like have a way to communicate with people that is completely private versus, have a community data trust that is really open and people share a lot of information about their communities and want to answer a bunch of questions about it. And these two things, one, can end up being in tension with each other, especially if the same person or same network wants to be a part of both. And right now, there's very little way to have any agency over, where the data gets transferred between one or the other. And so we do kind of have to create new structures here. And it should be in this very process-oriented rather than outcome-oriented way. And even in thinking about privacy, how do we incorporate things like new privacy-preserving techniques to share data and learn, and privacy-preserving machine learning and all of that, with this more sociological and almost philosophical concept of privacy that comes from autonomy and agency, and what questions do people want to have answered about their lives, and how do they identify those questions, and does that happen as an individual or as a group? So with that, I'll hand it over to Matt to solve all of these problems I've just laid out, and then we can kind of talk about, what kinds of identity frameworks do influence and belong in this data layer, because I think the broader point here is that whenever we come up with an identity solution, we're always reducing the rich concept of human identity in some way. We're always flattening something. And it's really a question of, which piece are we willing to flatten, and is it worth it? Are the benefits we get from architecting that solution in other ways, do they make it worth it for those potential harms that the ID piece might cause? And so with that, I'll hand it over to Matt.
All right, so I'm going to go really quickly through a sort of a big idea about adding some structure and texture to the way that we make decisions about data. So one way of understanding the problem that Divya was just describing is that essentially, because data really isn't this individual good, all of our sort of individual or many of our individualistic framings about how we make decisions about it just are just kind of fundamentally incoherent. So the usual framework is we sort of imagine ourselves as having a choice between individual decision making about our data disclosures with state controls or regulations versus individual decision making about our data without state control. So, translating that into English, it's like I'm making decisions about what to do with my data with GDPR or with, some consumer protection regime coming down from the state or not, right? And one way of understanding what's going on there is that there's a democratic input that is, controlling the individual decisions that we make about data, but it's happening at this super high level of like the federal government or the state or the EU. Now, in order for our decisions about data to kind of incorporate more textured information about what's needed for ourselves and our communities, and for them to be sort of the result of a genuine kind of democratic process, these decisions need to happen closer to the ground. So we're thinking here about how to build layers that, democratic decisional layers that people can interact with that sit, between the person and the state. So some of these, there are many of these models for this kind of intermediary. Like you may have heard lots of people talking about data cooperatives or data trusts or these kinds of things. That's the space that we're thinking about here. But the question is, in order for these kind of democratically accountable data intermediaries to function, and I think they can. I mean, just putting my cards on the table, I think that building this kind of structure is necessary to avoid this kind of terrible choice between chaotic individualism and like total state control. So I think this is the direction we need to move in. The question is like, how do we make it work? How do we make these intermediaries actually function democratically and in a practical way? So I think that there's a lot to say about this, but the place to start is just to think about what kinds of features would data coalitions or these democratic sort of data intermediaries need to have. So first of all, in order for people to interact with them in a democratic way, they would need to have some kind of a voting system, right? They would need some way for people to make democratic decisions about what is being done with their data. Second, for precisely the same reason that that individualistic decisions about data sort of collapse into a race to the bottom sort of dynamic, decisions made at the level of data coalitions could collapse into a sort of a race to the bottom dynamic if there isn't any kind of lateral way for data coalitions to interact with each other. So in other words, data coalitions themselves need ways of making claims against each other, arbitrating disputes against each other, operating within some kind of a framework to so that they aren't, some kind of a rule-based framework, basically, so that they aren't like undermining one another. So we need sort of arbitration between them. We need some kind of rails for sort of payment or communication to happen between data coalitions and people, and we need and finally we need probably some kind of a overarching scheme of regulation for the data coalitions themselves to ensure that they are essentially responsible to the people who are using them for democratic decision making, and don't sort of themselves become like misaligned counterparties that are in a position to exploit the people who are using them for decision making about data. So as we imagine this sort of big new layer of democratic decision making, there are all kinds of interactions between envisioning this sort of a system and ID. So one question I want to pose here is like, can we imagine this kind of new democratic decision layer, this new institutional layer being built without state ID? Or can we imagine it being built with state ID? Like, what are the sorts of trade-offs between the different identity systems that we might imagine underpinning this new layer of institutions? So Divya will say a little bit more about that now, but what the takeaway that I want to put out here right now is essentially that this problem of building a new democratic layer that sort of better structures our decisions about data is basically a really important problem, a really important thing that one way or another we're probably going to need to do in order to kind of strengthen the hand of individuals in the data economy and get away from the sort of dysfunctional and undemocratic status quo. So, okay, with that, Divya will say more about the identity trade-offs.
Yeah, so like Matt was saying, I mean, and how we introduce this question, we need to have some version of identity that allows us to, have voting, have interactions between coalitions, between people. And right now, we can say that the data space is really not set up with a coherent vision of identity. There are a bunch of just major issues that I think underpin a lot of just the broader problems that we see plaguing our tech ecosystem today. And some of those are, for example, like, we have very individual notions of data ownership, as we talked about earlier, but this isn't a coherent or useful way to think about data. Well, fixing that will require a way to attribute data to people, perhaps, or all of these other things that may trickle down into needing an identity solution. Right now, we often see data as either personal data or non-personal data, but a lot of, both on the technical side, we've seen how impossible anonymization really is, but also in other ways, it just doesn't really make sense to have a clear line between personal and non-personal data, which again comes back to a lot of the questions we were talking about with identity and what it means to hold an identity versus non, and transitioning between identities. Right now, people have very little control or voice over how their data is used, which means that they don't interact with all of these layers that hold and transact, and just the data interactions just happen abstracted away from them. If we want to fix this, then we need people to have visibility into how their data is used, which again requires some level of tying that back into who they are, and all of those pieces to influence, and understand the application of all of these different things. And so many of these pieces just require a very nebulous kind of identity solution. And so I think we should look at some of the pieces that we've been talking about on what identity means and kind of just look at them again through this lens of data. And I would say there's kind of not a linear progression, which is why I've scribbled on this slide, but kind of two sides maybe of how we might want to think about identity. And one is sort of the pure proof of personhood piece, right? Like, can we distinguish individuals from each other and ensure that they are real people? And that's like one thing that we could do. And on the other hand, we have like this extreme richness of humanity that we might want to capture, and identity has so much in there, and it's so generative. And Philip's great presentation on this like verb-like notion of identity, right? And in the middle, we may have a lot of different pieces of how we think about identity. We have a taxonomy approaches from Brian. We talked about some practical applications like proof of participation in certain ways, proof of membership in a community, right? Can we allow for a proof of personhood score and things like that? And all of these, I think, are capturing different points on this complicated spectrum of how much of identity we want to capture to solve specific problems that we might want to solve in the tech ecosystem as we see it. And I would say all the way on this side, this pure Sybil resistance piece, I would probably call that, necessary to an extent. There are a lot of places that you just need to know whether someone is a person or not, and to distinguish individual people from each other, but insufficient. It's just very rarely the case unless it's, very specific use cases like distinguishing bots from real users on social media. I mean, there are a couple cases where maybe pure Sybil resistance is all you need, but it's typically necessary and not sufficient. And then on this side, I would say the capturing the full spectrum of what identity really means is, of course, it's sufficient, but I think in many cases it's not necessary. And it's not just unnecessary because it's a lot of work or it's hard to do. I think it's can get us into kind of fixing or nailing down or flattening aspects of identity that we don't need to fix or nail down because we're trying to capture so much. And so many of the actual problems we want to solve are in this kind of messy piece in the middle where we have a lot of specific things we want identity to do. And we definitely want to be extremely careful about flattening notions of identity that shouldn't be flattened. And then we want to also be very careful about not needing to convey too much or needing to force people to sort of put up too much information. And so, we are thinking about these trade-offs in this vision of what identity could look like in terms of data coalitions. Oh, Matt, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. All right. So let me talk for a moment before you all get distracted by the many words on that slide. But so the point I'd like to make here is that when we think about these trade-offs with identity, there's sort of another ingredient to the trade-off, which is the question of what are we trying to do? So in other words, if we want to build some kind of ambitious new institutional structure that we think is necessary to solve a clear and present problem in society, right? Then we're going to need we're going to need to make assumptions about identity and to use some kind of a less than ideal identity system in order to make that our institutions function. And what we need to think about is like, first of all, the pros and cons of the identity system that we may be assuming or that we may be building as part of our new institution. And then second, we need to think about the pros and cons of building that new institution or not, right? Of sticking with the status quo or solving a problem, right? So in the context of data coalitions, right, there are the status quo is unsatisfactory for all these really deep ways. If we can build this new democratic layer, this new institutional structure, we may be able to deal with some of the biggest and kind of worsening problems in our society. Just to give a little bit more flavor, I don't think I gave quite enough flavor last time. It's like, for example, if we want to make decisions about what happens with our genetic data, for example, right? That shouldn't really be an individual decision because our genetic data reveals information about our family and so on and so forth. What if we could get together with our family to and democratically deliberate about the appropriate uses and handling of that information that impacts us all, right? And what if you could sort of imagine that sort of principle be proliferating throughout society, right? So that's the kind of thing that we might want to do here. And we're weighing that against the status quo. So we've now, back to the question of what sort of identity system is underpinning the coalitions, right? Just to simplify it slightly, let's think about sort of using a state identity system or a non-state identity system. So we have this first threshold question of what do we want to build this system or not, right? Do we want to build a network of data coalitions or not? If we use a state identity system, we are empowering the state, by building our new structure. If we use some non-state identity system, like proof of humanity or some other kind of solution, we're empowering that non-state system. So I mean, whatever identity system we choose, there's this major consequence in terms of like what we empower the whole institutional setup that makes that identity system possible, for better and for worse. Now let's think about some of these the features that we might want this coalition layer to have, right? So first of all, it's going to need to have proof of personhood, and it's going to have voting. If we use state ID, there are all kinds of access, inclusion, and security problems related to the use of state ID to underpin the voting. If we use non-state ID systems, then there's just different access, inclusion, and security problems, right? Instead of sort of systematically excluding, with state we may be systematically excluding undocumented people. With non-state, we may be systematically excluding people who don't have internet connection, for example. And if we choose neither, right? If we use a plutocratic identity system or neither, then we have this sort of race to the bottom of individual decision making, or we have plutocratic intermediaries, which defeats the purpose. Getting to regulation of intermediaries, if we use state ID to underpin this, then we are effectively opting into this whole network of state institutions, which giving them a role in the administration of the system. That we're then relying on legacy institutions to get it right. On the other hand, if we build a sort of a de novo system, if we build data intermediaries in a technical system that has no connection to the state, then we need to redesign we need to rebuild all of these completely new institutions. So one way of putting a fine point on this is that there are going to be sort of disputes that arise between individuals and coalitions, and between coalitions and between states and coalitions. If we use sort of a state system, then these disputes will be handled in courts, which are not perfect, but they exist. There's certain things that they do really well. On the other hand, if we build the whole thing in a kind of a parallel mirror world, we need to rebuild those dispute resolution institutions. So right now, what does that mean practically? It means like our data coalition is going to be resolving all of their complex disputes in like Claros courts, for example, or some other kind of Web3 dispute resolution process. Maybe so. That probably means we've just bit off a really big challenge in terms of like maturing those institutions and making them able to handle this complex, ambitious program. And a similar kind of problem arises when we start thinking about the ways that data intermediaries might need to interact with each other. I mean, who's going to set and enforce these rules that govern the way that one intermediary can make a claim on another, and so on, right? We have this sort of choice between using the existing state frameworks with all of their problems, or starting from the ground up and building a de novo system with all of the opportunities that represents to make things better, but also the huge challenges, right? I mean, it's not courts and legal systems are not built in a day, basically. So these are the kinds of things that we need to think about as we embark on these ambitious programs of building new democratic institutions and building interfaces between them and these the complex problem of data and other related issues in society. So I think that the takeaway here really is that the answer isn't simple. And I think that in order to get there, we basically need to proceed in sort of fits and starts, and we need to be comfortable mixing and matching identities, state identity solutions and novel non-state identity solutions. We need to be thinking about the problem that we want to solve, and looking for parsimonious identity. Basically looking for the most parsimonious way of building the needed identity functions into it, while also remaining attentive to this unavoidably normative question of whether the consequences of our identity choices are whether the cons outweigh the pros or vice versa. So I'll leave it there. Thanks. And
a super quick second. There's such great conversation happening in the chat, and I wanted to clarify like one or two things. One being, someone mentioned fiduciary responsibility, which we definitely do see that data coalitions should have fiduciary responsibility to members. And the second, I think, is around, can we have much richer governance excuse me, much richer governance systems than voting. And of course, the goal is to have much richer governance systems than voting. I think, the broad umbrella thing that we're going for here is autonomy and agency, not only from responsibility, but also to exert responsibility across pieces of data and building these collectives. I do think the reason that we've emphasized these bare bones pieces that are required to potentially make a system like this work is because in trying to solve some of these specific problems in a way that can leave open the possibility of a very different ecosystem of the internet, and yet begin now in terms of building layers on top of what we currently have, I think we do often want to start from bare bones solutions that are extremely aware of what their limitations might be. And if we find our bare bones solution does more harm than good, we don't do it, right? I mean, I think that's why we asked the question at the beginning, what do we enable by doing this, and is it worth it? But I don't think that we can solve the problem of rich layered identity plus rich layered governance systems for data with all of these attendant, challenges and additional institutions and interactions that we're going to need up front. I don't think that's possible or necessarily a productive way of looking at solving problems, going back to the very initial point. And we do need this to be process oriented and for input to sort of be gathered all along and to build up from something that might be quite skeletal. So that's my point of view, but I just wanted to quickly respond because I love those questions and I think a lot of really great conversation is happening. So thanks everyone for that.
Yeah, and I do want to say that there's a ton to say about fiduciary duties and about interaction between deliberative processes and voting processes, and I'm necessarily going through a really complex set of ideas super quickly here. So hopefully the broad strokes are coming across. Thanks.
Thank you, Divya and Matt. This was super informative, and I think can set us up for an interesting discussion. I just want to ask from you one additional maybe example if you can provide us of a concrete implementation of a even if it's a prototype of a data coalition as you envision, and maybe how that and what are the things that are already being achieved by these data collaboratives.
One of my favorite examples is sort of unsurprisingly, I guess, the kind of Airbox data coalition in Taiwan. And this is a case of, citizens all over the country basically installing these quite cheap Airbox sensors that are subsidized by either the state or sometimes private entities. Schools have done a lot of installing of them, and sharing pollution data to a centralized database in the government, but also one that is totally open for private, public, or civil entities to use. And so I think it is this question of, well, one, there's a problem of physical infrastructure, like the data is collected via physical infrastructure, which sometimes we don't talk about because we think of data as like, oh, something I just produce when I'm on Facebook, but it's really like hardware that is involved in creating this data coalition. There's partnership between a lot of different types of state and non-state entities in allowing for this to happen. And they've found basically that the measurements from this data coalition approach, rather than very centralized sensors that both the public and private sector had put out, because there were obviously other ways of measuring air pollution in Taiwan before this, but this worked a lot better because it was much more granular. And it allowed use as a teaching tool and students have come up with all of these different ways of reducing pollution in their own neighborhoods because they have access to this granular data. And so I think that is one piece of what's possible. And that's really on the community data trust side of the things that we've been talking about. There's also a lot of pieces around enabling more privacy or anonymity and all of that. That's on a very different side of what data coalitions can enable. So I think the point is that it's ideally quite a non-prescriptive way to enable different things to happen in the data ecosystem, where the coalitions are empowered to create the kind of outcomes that they want to see, without it being said that, oh, sharing data is really productive, like we should be doing more of that, and data coalitions are for sharing data and answering questions. Like maybe some people want that and others don't. And others may say, data coalitions are for privacy preservation, and we should have data coalitions that allow us to never share our data with anyone that we don't directly approve of. And maybe some people want that and others don't. And so ideally, and this is not a system that Matt and I have set up, obviously, because we'd be using it if it were, but ideally we'd be enabling, a range of those different possibilities.
All right, thank you so much. It's super illustrative. I also highly recommend reading Divya's report on civic technology in Taiwan, where there are other super interesting examples of data collaboratives that are already being implemented today. Now we're going to go into breakout rooms to discuss some of these ideas and finalize our inputs to Polis. So you can just share any thoughts that you have with your group, and also it's going to be fast, I'm sorry, 6 minutes just to vote like, dislike, or pass. And if you have any comments or thoughts just to share with your group, you can do it there. And then we'll come back and have a group discussion. So I'm sharing once again the Polis link. And please, let's go there. And yes, and we'll be separated into breakout rooms in a minute. Christopher, then All right, welcome back, everyone. Christopher, you had your hand raised, so you can go ahead, and then if anyone have any responses to what was presented or questions to our speakers, please go ahead. And just a quick note on that, you know, if you've already made a contribution, we don't have a lot of time, but try to also let others come in and contribute as well.
So just a quick thing, because I've been involved with the, you know, sometimes called data trusts, you know, other different types of, you know, group coordination of data, that there are some real risks of using terms and language that fall under property law. So anything that allows us to move out from that to things like law of agency is, I think, really important. And I do think that there are risks of people, I've seen this in Vermont and some other places where it's much too much accidentally falling into property law, which has all kinds of its own perils. So if people are interested in knowing more about that, I have a draft article. I'm trying to run it by some law scholars for some clarity right now, but it's pretty solid on why we selected law of agency as the basis for a lot of this stuff, and how it's not, you know, it's not property. Because it has agency, that means it also connects to fiduciary law, which means that, you know, you can always, as a principal authority, you can always say, I don't want you to be my agent anymore. So those are all good things. The second quick thing is, one of the reasons why Taiwan is able to do some of the wonderful stuff that they do is they have a legal definition of an anonymity set, which I think is 425 people for a geographic. I think they may have some other criteria for that, which they basically, that gives you a little bit of legal freedom to be able to collate some of this information and say that this neighborhood has high air pollution and not necessarily legally violates, nothing to do with what zero knowledge proofs or any of that kind of stuff. At least be able to say, hey, if you're aggregating 425 plus people, you're not violating the law. And that really helped facilitate some of the things there. There's some other great stuff going on in Taiwan, especially in the medical area. So I was involved with a medical data coalition type of thing. So that's it.
Let's talk about the Medical Data Coalition. That sounds really great. I think that absolutely the reason we probably started on this path even is to move away from notions of ownership. I actually think two ways that we talk about data, one is ownership, and the other is almost like a human rights type framework around, you know, privacy or other pieces. And I think they're both very difficult to actually handle in terms of building any new structures in the data space, because they have very individual notions of relationships to data that don't reflect what's actually happening, and also don't allow for that agency in a realistic way. So I think Matt can probably speak more to this as the lawyer amongst us, but I think that, you know, absolutely we want to move away from that notion of ownership.
Yeah, seconded. I would, Christopher, I'd love to know more about your work on agency law. That sounds terrific. Philip?
Thanks, Matt. So just very quickly, +1 on the unethical nature of proprietizing data. I would come at it from a slightly different perspective for those who've watched my presentation last week, where I argue that identity, relationships, and information exchange are reciprocally defining and co-constitutive. So if you proprietize data, you're proprietizing identity, and that's sick. That's sick in the old-fashioned sense of the word, not the way they use it now. That's just not on. So I've just got a few comments about both presentations. Firstly, I'd love to discuss the advantages of Android over iPhone. I feel like that's a different conversation, Albert. But to your point, last week I was quite a guarded advocate of privacy by design. rather than an unqualified advocate, partly because privacy by design denies context and undermines agency. So I prefer, I think, privacy by collective reflection, assuming that the collective in question has some governance capability in that requisite context, which I think is a nice segue then to some of the points that Divya and Matt raised. First, the idea that the outcome orientation could be described in terms of the missing identity layer. I think to use such technological reductive terminology is not what we should adopt in this community. To think of it as a technological layer is like to think of HTML as the conversation layer, or the faux ontology as the human relations layer. It's just not rich enough. It just doesn't do us justice as a highly evolved species. And I would like to see, instead of institutions and repositories of stocks of data, I'd like to see us explore how to think of data as on the edge rather than on a node, as a flow rather than as stocks. There's something that, instead of thinking it could it be socially meaningful or privacy preserving, we know we have the technology to do both of those. So I think that's particularly exciting. And then, of course, I will just finish, if I may, with that lovely scribbling that you did, Divya, which I like because I did scribbling last week, and it's the best way to convey some complexity. But when we think about flattening the beautiful, deep complexity of human identity, when we start thinking in our solutionist way that a part of it is redundant or not entirely necessary, then we are considering psychological, sociological, and ecological health as not entirely necessary because it doesn't quite suit the outcome that we're looking for in this particular context. And I think that's very dangerous.
Maybe we can go in order of provocation. So Albert, if you have any response, and then maybe Divya and Matt can go ahead.
I'm good right now. I'm listening and learning.
Divya, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think love to see kind of the energy around moving from an outcome-oriented to a process-oriented approach. I think that's great. In terms of the flattening, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, because one of the things that Matt and I discussed is, on one hand, yes, we are making a decision to take some pieces out of how we conceptualize identity in this context. And that we do lose something, and we probably do have, propagate some harms. And I would contend that perhaps anything that we do here will propagate some harm. So it's really a question of being incredibly careful about what those are and not, exacerbating existing inequalities. Or at some point for technology building, right, you have to have the strength to say we're propagating too much harm. We should not do this. And we haven't gotten to that point on data coalitions. I hope we don't get to that point on data coalitions, but I would like to believe that if we do see, we're doing too many types of flattening here that we cannot hold with, and that, don't have the effects, or, the communities we want to work with don't want this, then we don't build it, right? Like, I think that's absolutely correct. Like we should do something. But we were a little bit worried that if we do want to bring the fullness of identity to bear here, that we may run the risk of ossifying aspects of that, or like putting too much of something that could then not be changed, that then itself became a structural part of what identity is, that then itself became that cage within we see identity, if we bring too much of that solution to bear. And so is there a way that we can say, what do these communities really want from the identity solution for data? And can we mirror that rather than trying to bring something that I think is impossible probably in the end to truly create a technical version of? I think that the richness of humanity maybe cannot be done in that way, and so it's always going to be asymptotic. And so it's a question of, is there a point at which we do harm by trying to get closer to that plateau? And that's an open question. I don't have an answer, but it's definitely something that was top of mind for me when we were thinking about this.
I think just maintaining it as a question I don't think you can answer it, but maintaining it as a question front of mind is absolutely essential. Our species has a reputation, particularly over the last 150 years, of changing small things to complex adaptive systems and thinking we're providing a solution, and then we just fuck up the entire ecology. And in this instance, we're grappling with, we are the ecology. And so the damages can be quite immense. However, I would argue that, and I touched on this briefly last week, that when we're contemplating proof of personhood or proof of humanness, and you may recall I gave two different definitions of either of those to make them distinct, we might not be grappling with identity at all, which could be good news. Because identity is about, well, many things, but you can say it's same as and different from. But in this instance, just to say a member of an entire species doesn't really have any same as informational content or different from informational content. So we could be contemplating something here that we can separate from identity, which I said also was quite difficult to do when you're working with identity. Separation of concerns within identity is a failed engineering principle.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm talking too much already, so I hope someone else will share their wonderful thoughts on this.
Oh, one worry that I have, Philip, is that when we're thinking about how proof of personhood solutions can be employed, I think there's always the need to kind of pair these solutions with other types of data. Like there are few use cases, they might be very important, like, you know, global governance, I don't know, things that where all humans are involved. But when I'm thinking more practically how these networks can be utilized, there will be other types of data that need to be kind of coupled with the Sybil resistance proof. So we again get into that problematic sphere.
Yes, in short.
I guess
I agree.
Since I missed Philip's presentation, I'm lacking some of the context, but I do think something you just said rang true to me, which is, I think proof of personhood and identity are two like almost orthogonal concepts to each other, or maybe you could say that one is a. To me, it's very important that when we try to design systems, that we try to design minimal as opposed to maximal systems. And so I think, you know, this reduction to the simple assertion that this address or this handle or whatever is currently controlled with high likelihood by a human is about as reductionist, I think, as you can get. And I think that's actually a feature, that's not a bug.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why our initial kind of data collision piece also is very much what's the least infrastructure or the least information you might need to create this. And then we hopefully have all the tools and community agency to build on top of that. And that's perhaps one of the better ways that this can evolve organically rather than being sort of a top-down architectural process. So,
I mean, one way I think about this a little bit is that there's you want to, if you're building an identity system, you want to arrogate as little power to it as possible without having any idea about how that power will be used. So for example, if you build a super rich mirror of people, if you build a fully featured identity that has all kinds of information about everybody, then you know you can anticipate that will have unintended consequences. That will make the system be used for things other than what it was intended to be used for, right? Similarly, though, if you use a minimalistic approach, if you don't have as much information, if you just have like a proof of personhood system or something, then that system can end up arrogating unanticipated power to itself by becoming the base layer of other systems that build on it and add complexity to it. So basically, it's like whether you're doing the detailed thing or whether you're doing the minimal parsimonious thing, you need to think about the failure modes of both of those, and then try to essentially make sure that neither thing, you can't foresee the way these things could go wrong, basically. You just can't. So you just have to try and build them in as fail-safe.
You can't see all the things that will go wrong with them, but you can definitely see some things that will go wrong with them.
Oh yeah, that's
okay. Just
a more accurate way of saying what I meant to say. I totally agree. Right. You have to see as many of the things as possible, but you can never foresee the full set of possible failures. Yeah.
Unless you are a complete genius, Matt. Yeah.
Nope.
All right. Anyone else has any comments or reactions, especially some of the practitioners in the room? Any impressions to share? Okay. I guess, well, the question then that comes up to me, Matt, responding to what you've just said. So basically, we're talking about kind of these separations of responsibilities and agency between different types of protocols that have under their domain different aspects of information, right? Is that what you're pointing to? And then, if that's where we're at, maybe I'm interested from you, where do you think, or like, what are the things that proof of personhood protocols in particular should be particularly aware of? What are the, I would say, perils or risks that we really want to avoid, are also some of the opportunities here. And I bring this up because one of the reasons why I thought it would be really interesting to share this idea on data coalitions with this group is that, in particular, subjective-based proof of personhood protocols are, I think, have the potential to be brought forth by these types of collectives as strongly as I think right now quadratic funding has kind of moved the field forward and gave it a really important utility. So whenever you're, if you're envisioning these data collaboratives in action and utilizing proof of personhood solutions for their governance, so that the people who are involved in it can participate in how decisions are being made, what are some of the things that POP protocols should be aware of, or how they can even kind of prepare the ground for this to emerge?
Yeah, great question. So on the first one, if I understood the question correctly, you're asking whether coalitions are sort of like repositories of all this information. Did I get that right, Paula?
Yes, I mean a separate repository.
Well, so one important thing is that I think that even that dimension of this architecture can be questioned and should be done with as much parsimony as possible. So, for example, I'm basically agnostic, but I think that one promising direction for envisioning what intermediaries or coalitions could be doing is not holding data, but like gating it, so serving as sort of essentially operating the sort of gates in like structured transparency systems. So data might live in all different places, and and it be shared through sort of complex like privacy enhancing technologies, and coalitions might just be making the sort of critical decisions about how what sort of minimal information is allowed to sort of pass from the membership to to some third party, right? So in this sense, coalitions, you could try to minimize, and probably should try to minimize, the amount of information that coalitions have about members, right? And then on the second point, if you think about using proof of personhood systems as a basic layer for this, there's all kinds of possible unintended consequences that could have. One is if those, or I guess to put it broadly, one is locking people into a set of institutions that are linked to those proof of personhood layers. So, for example, if we have Claros courts, for example, that have like records of institutional interactions that particular proof of personhood, particular people have used before them, right? Then people could get locked into, that's that institutional layer. So to the extent that there are problems with that institutional layer, then building an important piece of infrastructure on top of it will lock people into those problems. Another.
So I'm confused. Are you saying that there needs to be a right to fork, or is there a, or are you just talking about the risk of lock-in to, the next, the decentralized Facebook, which may not be, be as bad as the Facebook, but it could be worse?
Yeah, I think I'm talking about the latter. Okay. And then second, it's like, even though the proof of personhood layer might be this parsimonious thing, maybe it links to your real world ID, maybe it doesn't, maybe you can sort of shield it through a zero knowledge proof or something. But there's just basically you can just imagine more layers of identity being built on top of that they get exposed, or that people are and they compromise people's interests, either through the exposure of that information or because they're locked into some institutional framework through it. There's just
can we turn that into a little bit of a user story? So sure. You're part of some community that has decided to do mutual group income. I've seen a couple of interesting projects of that. So it's voluntary group income. And you've been a participant for 5 years. You've kind of grown the wealth of the community or whatever. And for whatever reason, they've gone off in a direction that you're not happy with. But you're kind of you can't leave because you're dependent on that group income in some fashion, and you have no way to kind of move it to some other context. Is that an example of this in a microcosm, or are you talking about nation state type of or international court type of capture?
I'm really talking about both. I think Ted just had a comment there that one thing that might help with lock-in is not only the right to fork, but built-in coordination to assist with forking. I think that kind of structure is also super important. So I think what you're hearing me do right now is just struggle against the infinite range of things that could go wrong. I can't articulate all of them.
I think that's generally impossible, and I would go one step further, which is even knowing that some things will go wrong and knowing precisely what they are still makes efforts worthwhile, right? we know that when we create a vaccine, for example, that some people will have an adverse reaction to that vaccine and some people will die from that adverse reaction. And it still makes making the vaccine worthwhile, right? And we know that if we have proof of personhood systems, some people are going to get locked out of things because for some reason there's some error. And I don't think you can build a system that guarantees that that will never happen. And yet still, so I think all of this comes down to trying to catalog risks, catalog adversary, and just thinking about like which of these are acceptable at the end of the day and why are they acceptable? And then we'll still discover new ones as we go along, you know. So I just.
Well, I think that's a topic of next week is how do we begin to create some of these things? Is that correct, Paula?
Yes, well, so we're going to have a week-long break, and one of the group exercises that I want us to go through is to take a look at the reports that we've been putting together. And you all have the link, and I'll be sharing that once again over email, including the report of our conversation today. And then in 2 weeks from now, we're going to meet again and discuss where to move forward with our activities and as a group. So I would love for you to read this report, to edit it, to complete it in any way you see fit. This can be, you know, a collaborative effort, and then come with all of this in mind, and hopefully already start thinking about what are the really important things that we should be working on together. As we are a very, very still small group of people, we can get in the same room, we can collaborate, we can create different working groups. There were fascinating ideas that were brought up throughout these 4 sessions. We're also compiling them, so it will be easier for us to discuss that in 2 weeks from now. But yeah, this is what we're going to have ahead. These were, in my view, extraordinarily productive discussions. We really want to take this material, record it, and propagate it because the content here was really important and unique, and we don't want this to kind of be forgotten with these kind of temporary Zoom encounters. So we want this report also to be something that can be shared with others who are just coming to learn about proof of personhood for the first time and might want to contribute. With that in mind, everyone is welcomed to collaborate to these docs, and yeah, we'll see each other again in 2 weeks.
Thanks so much, Paula.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Divya.
Thank you.
Matt.
Thank you.
Albert.
Take care.
Thank you,
Bye.
Bye.